The galaxy possessed a peculiar way of determining what was important and what was not. It had been doing so for millennia, long before humans first looked at the stars and asked, "Is there anyone out there who is looking back?" Strong planets kept their seats at the table. Weak ones became footnotes in someone else's history. That was simply how things worked. No one wrote this rule down anywhere. No one needed to. Every civilization that survived long enough understood it on their own. The Galactic Concord was the closest thing to a government the galaxy knew. It consisted of 47 star-faring civilizations, each with its own history, its own fleet, its own agenda. They met in a vast hall on a neutral station called ARS Prime, in a structure the size of a city floating in the void between three star systems. The hall was immense, seats arranged in wide rings. Like an amphitheater built for giants, delegates from many worlds sat in these tiers, each in their own colors, breathing their filtered air, watching one another with the particular patience that comes from knowing that every word spoken in this room could mean war, trade, or oblivion for 100 years. Earth held a seat in the outer ring, the so-called provisional tier, where new members sat until the Concord decided they were worth something more. It wasn't an insult per se, it was just how things were done. Old members sat closer to the center. New members sat on the edge, watching and learning. Humanity had been a provisional member for 6 years, long enough to learn the rules, but not long enough to change them. Ambassador Yara Oe represented Earth at the Concord. She was a tall woman with short gray hair and eyes that rarely gave away her thoughts. She had spent 30 years in diplomacy before this appointment. Like everyone who was there, she had mastered the most important skill in the job, the ability to sit perfectly still and listen while others did things they assumed you did not understand. She was very good at it. On the morning that would later be called the turning point, she sat in her seat in the outer ring and watched as the Vorat delegation made their way toward the center of the hall. The Vorats were reptilian. They stood on 2 legs, but their bodies were wide and low, their necks thick, eyes set wide apart on angular heads. They moved with a certain heaviness, as if every step were a small assertion of their presence. They hailed from the Vorat Dominion, a stretch of space encompassing 11 systems on the galactic east, built entirely through conquest. Over the last 2 centuries, they had consumed 4 civilizations. 2 of those civilizations no longer existed in any meaningful form. Supreme Marshal Katara did not attend the Concord meetings personally. He sent his ambassador, a Vorat named Drex. Drex was polished enough to say terrible things in very clean language. Drex was good at his job. He was dressed in the official colors of the Dominion, deep black with gold markings along the collar, and spoke with the measured tone of a man who had already decided how the conversation would end. Drex stood in the center of the hall and requested a formal review of Earth's membership classification. The hall shifted implicitly, not in a way that would show up on the transcript, but Yara felt it. A slight tension in how certain delegates held themselves. The cautious blankness on the faces of the Ket delegation, sitting in the inner ring, whose trade ships used the same lanes as the Earth ones. A slight, almost bored tilt of the head from the Solari representative, who was old enough to have seen 4 civilizations lose their status in this room. Drex laid out his position with the efficiency of a man who had rehearsed many times. Earth, he said, was a provisional member only on paper, but a burden in practice. A single system sat at the intersection of 3 major trade lanes, the corridor, the tree pass, and the outer rim route. Paths along which shipments of rare elements were transported, worth more than most small planets could generate in decades. A system of such importance, Drex argued, required a protector, a guardian, something with teeth. Then, he showed the scan data, collected by a Vorat long-range scout vessel 3 months ago, under the guise of routine astronomical surveys. The data was clean and exhaustive, and it showed exactly what it showed. The defense of the Sol system, by any galactic standard, was practically non-existent. 1 orbital defense platform above Earth, old and lightly armed. A small fleet of 7 short-range frigates, clearly intended for patrol, not combat. No dreadnoughts, no battleships, no deep space fortifications beyond the single platform. Drex let the data hang on the hall's screens for a long moment before speaking again. He said that according to Article 12 of the Concord Charter, a member world that could not demonstrate an adequate capacity for self-defense could be reclassified as a non-militarized dependent territory. A dependent territory had no veto power. A dependent territory could not refuse defensive oversight by a more capable member. A dependent territory was, for all practical purposes, up for grabs. He didn't say the word up for grabs out loud. He didn't need to. Yara observed the room. She saw the Kinnean delegate studying the table in front of him. She saw the Solari representative make a small note on his tablet. She saw 3 different inner-ring delegates exchange glances that were too quick to be accidental. She noted all of this with the meticulous attention of a person who is putting things away for later. Then Drex said something that made the entire hall go silent. He said that the Vorat Dominion, as a senior member of the Concord with long-range deep space patrol capabilities, was prepared to offer Earth its protection out of respect for the values of the Concord, out of concern for the stability of those 3 critical trade routes, and out of simple neighborly courtesy. A few delegates coughed. One of them might have been trying to hide a chuckle. Yara stood. She didn't ask for the floor. She didn't wait for the chair to recognize her. She simply stood, and the hall turned its gaze upon her. She spoke in the calm voice of a person who was not surprised by any of this, and had not been surprised for a long time. She said that Earth thanked the Vorat Dominion for its concern. She said the Earth delegation would consider the proposal in accordance with the Concord's standard procedure, which provided 30 days for a formal response. She said this without emotion, without heat, without anything that could be described as anxiety. She sat back down. Drex looked at her for a moment, then nodded and returned to his seat. The session ended. The delegates dispersed into their corridors. Yara walked with an even pace to the private reception room of the Earth delegation, a modest set of rooms in the outer wing of ARS Prime. Her assistant, a young man named Thomas, efficient, smart, and still young enough to show his feelings on his face, walked beside her, and he looked shaken. She did not. She told him to send a message to Earth. Priority, encrypted, full compression, marked for the Secretary General's office and the Joint Chiefs of Staff simultaneously. He asked what the message should contain. She thought for a moment, then told him the message should contain exactly 4 words. They made their move. Thomas sent the message. He did so without fully understanding. He was too new to diplomacy to understand that sometimes 4 words are enough, that sometimes the person on the other end of the line had been waiting for those 4 words for years. 38 light-years away, in the military city of the Vorat Dominion, Katara, Supreme Marshal Katsara read his ambassador's report and was satisfied. Katsara was old by Vorat standards. His scales had changed color from greenish-brown to dark gray at the edges, and the crest over his eyes had thickened with age, giving him the appearance of being perpetually angry. He had commanded fleets for 50 years. He had taken 2 systems by force, one by negotiation backed by a clear threat of force, and one simply by showing up with enough ships that the other side decided further reflection was not worth the trouble. He understood power the way a surgeon understands a body, not as something to be admired, but as something to be properly used at the right moment, with the right pressure. He read the scan data again. He had read it 4 times before. Nothing had changed. 1 orbital platform, 7 frigates, no deep space capabilities worthy of note. His analysts had cross-checked the data against 3 independent surveys and the Concord's own public records. Humans had been in space for less than a century. They had achieved faster-than-light travel only 40 years ago. Hardly enough time to establish a few colony ships, let alone a battle fleet. Their industrial base was significant, his analysts noted, but entirely oriented toward civilian needs, energy production, power systems, colonial infrastructure, not warships. Worse, one of his young officers had noted something in the report, a memo suggesting that there were unusual thermal readings at the bottom of Earth's oceans that could indicate subterranean construction. The note was attached as an addendum. Katsura read it, then moved on. Thermal readings at the ocean floor could mean 100 things: geological activity, tidal energy collection, the construction of underwater habitats. There was no evidence of weapons, production, no evidence of anything that would alter what the scan data clearly showed. He convened his war council. There were 7 of them, the senior commanders of the Vorat military apparatus. They sat around a long table of dark stone in a windowless room, because Katsara had always considered windows in command rooms a distraction. He laid out the situation without drama, showed them the data, showed them the trade routes, showed them Earth's position at the intersection of all 3. He told them what he intended to do. The council approved it unanimously. It took less than 20 minutes. Katsara assembled a fleet of 200 warships. Not everything the Dominion had that would be wasteful. 200 was more than enough to deal with 7 frigates and 1 old platform. He chose his best captains, not because he expected a real battle, but because sloppy work against a weak opponent was still sloppy work. He had standards. The fleet would depart for Seoul. It would arrive with weapons hot. It would deliver a formal demand for Earth's surrender regarding military oversight. Earth would comply because Earth would have nothing to fight with, and because humans, in his experience, were rational enough to understand the math. 200 warships versus 7 frigates is not a battle, it is an announcement. Katsura gave the order to depart in 72 hours. Back on ARS Prime, the gears turned as they always moved in places where many civilizations lived side by side, and no one trusted anyone completely slowly on the surface, quickly underneath. In the public corridors, the business of the Concord continued as usual. Delegates attended committee meetings. Trade agreements were reviewed, debated, and postponed for further study. 3 minor border disputes. In the main hall, the Article 12 question regarding Earth awaited its turn for formal debate, as procedure required. In the private rooms behind closed doors and in conversations that were never recorded, it was a different story. The Ket delegate, a cautious creature named Worf, who had represented his people for 20 years, spoke quietly with 2 other inner ring delegates over a meal. He said nothing directly. He asked questions. Had anyone checked Earth's defense data independently? Did the Article 12 motion have the necessary number of votes to pass? Had anyone tipped the humans off informally that the motion was coming? As a courtesy? Both other delegates looked at their food. Worf understood. He nodded slowly. He said no more. On the other side of the station, in a rarely used corridor, the Solari representative walked alone with an unhurried step. He was very old, even by the standards of his kind, and in his long career, he had seen things that most people on this station only read about. He had been present when the Dreven Collective lost its membership status. He had been in the room when the Merrick agreed to Vorat oversight and ceased to exist as an independent civilization 8 years later. He stopped for a moment and looked out a viewport at the stars. He thought of the human ambassador, her stillness, the 4 words she had sent home. He hadn't intercepted the message, but he had worked on the station long enough to know when someone was sending a signal, not asking for help. He had seen panic in this hall many times. He knew what it looked like. The human woman had not shown the slightest sign of it. He found that interesting. He also found it slightly unsettling in the sense that very experienced people sometimes worry not about what is obviously dangerous, but about what is too calm when it should be afraid. He walked on. He had a meeting. Life went on the edge of great events. On Earth, the message arrived early in the morning, local time, in Geneva, where the Secretary General's office was located. It was decrypted in seconds and delivered to 2 people simultaneously. The Secretary, General herself, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a man named Admiral Eric Wiens, who had served in the military for 40 years and for the last 15 of them had been preparing for this exact moment. Wiens read the 4 words on his secure screen. He sat with them for a moment, then picked up another device, not connected to any public network, which had no record of transmission anywhere on Earth's open communication network, and made a call. The call was short. He spoke 3 words. Initiate observer protocol. That was all. He put the device down. He looked out his office window at the city below, caught in the early morning. Lights reflected on the wet streets. He thought about the 200 warships that were likely loading and refueling at a Vorat shipyard somewhere across the galaxy. He thought about what their commanders expected to find when they arrived at Seoul. A small, sad smile appeared on his face. He thought about all the years of quiet work, all the decisions made in rooms smaller than this by people who understood what the rest of the galaxy had yet to realize. He thought about the cold, the darkness of the asteroid belt, and what was waiting there in the silence. He hoped the Vorats had good doctors. They would need them. He snorted. He returned to his desk. There was much to do and little time. Outside the window, the city continued to sleep, entirely ordinary, entirely peaceful, having no idea that somewhere in the galaxy a fleet of 200 warships had just set course for home, not suspecting that home was ready. The Pacific Ocean had always kept secrets. It was the largest body of water on Earth. In some places, it was deeper than the tallest mountains, and the bottom was darker than anywhere else on the surface of the planet. Humans had explored it for centuries and still hadn't been able to map it fully. In its deepest parts lived strange creatures that needed no light and that had evolved entirely in pressure, cold, and silence. The ocean did not give up what it held without a struggle. It had been hiding something for 37 years. Commander Darovo stood on the upper observation deck of the transport shuttle as it descended through 3,000 meters of black water. She looked through the reinforced glass, watching the lights of the facility appear below, like a city emerging from the fog. She had made this descent more than 100 times in her career. It never became mundane. The bastion yard stretched across the bottom of the Pacific, in a complex encompassing more land than some small countries. It had been built in pieces for decades. Each section was added carefully and quietly and covered with so much bureaucratic documentation that things disappeared into filing cabinets and stayed there. Construction crews signed agreements that weren't quite official state secrets, but weren't quite labor contracts either, but something in between. They built something huge in the dark, and then went home and said nothing, because they understood what they were building and why it had to remain a secret. The yard could build a dreadnought from the keel to launch in 14 months. It had done so 11 times. Darovo stepped off the shuttle into the main reception bay, a chamber large enough to house an air wing, and was met by her second-in-command, a compact and serious man named Lieutenant Commander Ren Park, who silently handed her a tablet with the status and stood beside her. The tablet showed Darovos everything she needed to know in a brief overview. Activation order received 41 minutes ago. Stage 1 protocols already executing. Power systems coming online sequentially. Crew recall is being handled by standard cover signals, a series of seemingly random commercial broadcasts which, for the right people listening on the right frequencies, meant very specific instructions. She asked Ren how long it would take for the Continental detachment to be ready. He said, 36 hours, if everything goes smoothly. She asked what was likely not to go smoothly. He said that the reactor of the Titan's Fury, the United Earth Fleet, UEF, had been idling for the last cycles, and the engineers were cautiously optimistic about its launch to full power on schedule, which, in his experience, meant they were not optimistic at all. She told him to put his best team on it. She walked through the yard as Ren briefed her, past dry docks where smaller vessels were refueling and loading, past machine rooms where the hum of work was already rising to something that felt more like a vibration in the bones than a sound in the ears. Workers moved with purpose. No one ran. Running in such a facility led to accidents, but everyone moved as if the floor beneath them were slightly tilted in the direction they needed to go. Darovos had served in the military for 22 years. She had served on 3 different ships. She had commanded a destroyer for 4 years before moving into the strategic command structure, and for the last 6 years had been the operational commander of what the yard called the surface layer, the visible part of Earth's defense. The 7 frigates and the orbital platform that the galaxy could see, measure, and seemingly despise. She had never told anyone what she actually commanded. Not at parties, not to family, not to anyone who didn't already know. Why? Because anyone who already knew understood why one didn't speak of it. She thought about the Vorat scan data, which had been quietly intercepted and copied months before it was presented to the Concord. She thought about the analytical report she had read, detailing how thoroughly and confidently the Vorats had come to the conclusion that Earth was defenseless. She thought about a small note in one of those reports. A junior Vorat officer had noted the thermal readings from the bottom of Earth's oceans as potentially significant. The note was reviewed by a senior officer and downgraded in priority. She had read that note 3 times. She was grateful for confident enemies. 52 million kilometers away, in the outer part of the asteroid belt, 14 ships were waking up. They had been there for a long time. The oldest of them, the Sovereignty of the United Earth Fleet, UEF, had drifted in the belt for 19 years. Its power systems had been reduced to the absolute minimum necessary to keep internal systems from complete failure. Its crew rotated every 6 months with people who traveled to and from it on small, unmarked transport vessels that moved without transponder signals. The new ones had been there for less time, but all of them had waited long enough that the crews serving on them considered the waiting simply the nature of the work. They were dreadnoughts. The word didn't fully convey what they were, because words are built on the experience of those who use them, and no one in the galaxy had seen anything like them. Each was between 3 and 12.5 kilometers in length. These were not graceful ships. They were not built for that. They were built the way a hammer is built for what they did, not for what they looked like. Their hulls were dark and multi-layered, made of materials developed over 30 years of research into what happens when something tries very hard to destroy something else and fails. Their weapon systems included mass drivers capable of accelerating a dense metal projectile to a significant fraction of the speed of light, energy weapons for short-range work, banks of Shinnuron missiles capable of launching enough warheads into space to fill a small sky. Their point defense systems were perhaps the most remarkable thing about them. Each dreadnought was surrounded, when active, by a network of small, automated weapon platforms that tracked and destroyed incoming projectiles with a speed and accuracy that made the space around the ship practically impenetrable. It had been designed, and then redesigned again by teams of engineers who had spent their careers thinking about what someone would try to do to such a ship, and then making sure it wouldn't work. The dreadnoughts also had something no other military force in the known galaxy had yet brought to practical application: targeting systems with a truly effective artificial intelligence. The unrefined, automated systems that most species used were capable of performing simple tracking tasks but needed human oversight for anything complex. These were systems that could manage an entire combat engagement without a human giving them individual instructions, that could assess a changing field of hundreds of targets simultaneously and make decisions in fractions of a second. That would take a human team at least seconds. Humans had long been good at calculations. It turned out that calculations, scaled and applied to the task of destroying something very quickly and very accurately, were extremely useful. The first sign of life on the dreadnoughts was light. Not a dramatic burst of full power, but a slow leakage of illumination along darkened corridors as one system after another returned from standby mode. Internal lighting, then life support, then communication networks. Then deep in the engine room of each ship, the first low hum of a reactor beginning to warm from a cold start to operating temperature. A crew member on the Indomitable of the United Earth Fleet, UEF, a young woman named Specialist Ashade, who was on her first assignment on the Continental Detachment and still hadn't ceased to wonder at the size of the ship she lived on, was in the machine monitoring compartment when the main reactor began its startup sequence. She had been told this would happen. She had read the protocols and gone through training simulations. She was not prepared for how it felt. A reactor coming to full power wasn't noise. It was a change in everything. The floor beneath her feet shifted from stillness to a barely perceptible, constant presence of life. The air in the compartment shifted pressure slightly. Every screen in the room switched from amber standby to operational white. And through the hull, through 3 meters of composite armor capable of withstanding a direct hit from most warship weapon systems, she felt the hum of something enormous choosing to awaken. She froze for a moment. Then she ran the checks and submitted a report, because that was her job, and the ship needed her to do her job. Commander Dorovos received confirmation of the belt's activation 12 hours later. By then, she was in the command center of the Bastion Yard, standing before the main tactical display, a 3-dimensional holographic map of the Sol system, covering most of the large room, where every tracked object was represented by a small light and a data tag. The asteroid belt on the display looked the same as it always did from outside. A scattered field of rocks, dust, and debris, a chaotic remnant of something that tried to become a planet and never succeeded. But when she filtered the display to show the returns of the Yard's own deep-ping long-range sensors, other things appeared in the belt. 14 objects, each of them large and geometrically regular. Each now showed a faint but unmistakable power signature of a reactor operating in warm mode. They looked like small suns being born in slow motion. Dorovos stood with her hands behind her back, watching the lights ignite. Ren came over and stood beside her. He looked at the display. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said that, by his estimates, the Vorats would arrive at the edge of the solar system in approximately 70 hours. She nodded. He asked her, and in the way he asked, there was something quieter than in his usual professional manner. Do you think it will actually work? Not the battle, of course, but everything together. The plan that has been running for 37 years, which was built by dozens of people, most of whom didn't live to see this moment. She thought seriously about the question. She didn't dismiss it. Ren wasn't asking out of doubt. She knew he didn't have any, but out of that kind of honest wonder that comes from standing on the edge of something that should be theoretical and discovering that it has become real. She said, yes, it will work, because it was designed by people who understood the first and most important thing about fighting from a position of perceived weakness, that the enemy's confidence is your most powerful weapon. The Vorats are coming because they believe in the math. 200 against 7. They calculated the outcome before they ever left their home. They aren't coming to fight, they're coming to arrive. And when you believe you are arriving, rather than fighting, well, you don't bring your best thinking, you bring your paperwork. She looked at the 14 lights in the belt. She said, I'm not afraid, not even a drop. On the dark side of the moon, in a facility called Fort Silence, the lights had been burning for hours. Fort Silence was not a dramatic name, but it was accurate. The facility had been built into lunar rock for 20 years, carved with the same patient secrecy as the bastion yards. And it had earned its name because no signal had ever escaped from it that wasn't intended to go out. It was shielded, buried, cold on the outside, undetectable by any scan the galaxy had yet developed. It was the brain of Earth's real military apparatus, and it had been thinking for a very long time. Admiral Haruta Shen arrived at Fort Silence via the sublunar transit tunnel from a landing pad on the near side. He was 61 years old. He was fit and gray-haired, with a posture that never fully relaxed, even in quiet rooms. He had commanded the Continental Detachment for 7 years. Before that, he was the chief strategic architect of something called the Iron Doctrine, the real military strategy of Earth, known in its full form to fewer than 200 living people. He walked into the main command center of Fort Silence and looked at the screens. There were many screens, and they showed him everything. The projected course of the Vorat fleet, updated by a passive sensor network scattered throughout the outer solar system, the current status of the 14 dreadnoughts in the belt, readiness reports of the bastion yards, a tactical display of the Sol system with every rock and lane and calculated firing angle already mapped and modeled and remodeled. He took a cup of coffee from the station by the door and stood before the main display, looking at the galaxy. It was how a chess player looks at a board when he has been thinking 10 moves ahead for 37 years, and the other player has finally made the move the whole game had been waiting for. A young officer asked him if he needed anything. He said, "No." He asked her if the fleet was on schedule. She said, "Yes, sir. All 14 confirmed as warm, and the crews are at 70% capacity. Full complement expected in 20 hours. He nodded. He drank his coffee. He thought about the 200 Vorat ships in FTL space, moving at speed toward a system they thought was theirs. He thought about their captains reading their screens, conducting their calculations, confident in the math of overwhelming force. He thought about what they expected to find. He thought about what they would actually find. He put down the cup. He said quietly to no one in particular, "It has been a long wait." Then he set to work. The edge of the Sol system was not a line, not a wall, no marker, no clear boundary where one ended and the other began. Space doesn't work like that. But humans had decided several years ago that the edge of their system began at the outer boundary of the Oort cloud, that vast and distant shell of frozen objects drifting at the limit of the sun's gravitational reach, so far that the sun itself was just the brightest star in the sky, not the thing that governed the world. They had placed sensors there, passive, cold and quiet, embedded in the surfaces of rocks that looked like any other rocks in the cloud. The sensors had lain there for 19 years, listening, and never had anything important to report until now. The first contact alert reached Fort Silence at exactly 14 minutes past 3 a.m., Greenwich time, which the facility used because someone had decided many years ago that a single time zone made coordination easier, and no one had argued. The alert wasn't a sound or a light. It was a small entry on a screen in the passive sensor monitoring room, a room constantly staffed by 3 analysts whose job was to observe those screens and report anything that wasn't background noise. When Analyst Second Class Priametta, one of the 3 on duty, saw the entry, she looked at it. She looked again. She ran the verification protocol, which took 40 seconds and confirmed what she had seen. Then she pressed the alert key and reported up the chain in the compressed, factual language her training required. Vorat fleet exited FTL, outer edge of the Oort cloud. Preliminary contact count, 193 vessels. Approximate bearing, direct course to Sol. Speed, standard sublight approach. Likely reduction to tactical speed in approximately 6 to 8 hours. She submitted the report and returned to watching the screens, because that was her job, and the rest was someone else's job. And the system worked because everyone did their part. Admiral Shen was awake. When the alert came, he hadn't slept for the previous cycle, not fully. He had dozed for a few hours in a chair in his office, which wasn't sleep in the medical sense, but was the kind of rest experienced military people learned to take when full sleep was a luxury the schedule didn't allow. When his communications officer knocked and entered, reporting that the contact was confirmed, he was already sitting up. He walked to the main command center with his coffee fresh this time, and stood before the display, which had updated in the seconds since the alert, showing the Vorat fleet as a cluster of red contact markers on the system's far edge. From such a distance, compared to the scale of the Sol system map, 200 enemy ships looked like a small smudge of color. He knew not to take comfort in that. Commander Dorovos made contact from the bastion yards within minutes. Her image appeared on a secondary screen next to the main display. Her resolution was a bit lower due to the relay through deep water, but her voice was clear. She reported that all 14 dreadnoughts were fully crewed and fully charged, that the fleet was in position in the belt and awaiting orders, and that the reactor issue of the Titan's Fury had been resolved 40 minutes before contact. An engineer named Kowalski had apparently worked 2 full rest periods to achieve it. Dorovos said she intended to give Kowalski a very long vacation when all this was over. Shen said that sounded reasonable. He requested a full tactical breakdown. The next 2 hours were work-detailed, technical, focused work, the kind that doesn't make for good stories but is the reason good tactical teams modeled approach vectors. They assessed the probability of formation variance based on the fleet composition, which sensors now clearly identified. They confirmed the positioning of the Hastis array, a network of mass drivers built into selected asteroids throughout the belt. Each was targeted and calibrated and ready part of the landscape of the Sol system, not something the enemy would see coming. They checked the point defense network, cross-checked the communication relay with Fort Silence, and confirmed response protocols with the captains of each dreadnought via the encrypted command channel. All 14 confirmed readiness. At the 6th hour, when the Vorat fleet reduced speed to tactical and moved through the deep outer system at a speed suggesting they were running active scans, checking the system as they approached, not bothering with concealment because why would they need to? Shen made the decision on timing. He wouldn't wait until they reached the asteroid belt. He wouldn't wait until they reached the orbit of Jupiter or Mars or any other landmark. He would address them when they reached the point he had long ago designated on his maps as the threshold, a specific distance from the inner system, beyond which retreat was possible, but significantly more difficult. He wanted them to have passed the threshold when he spoke. He wanted them to be committed. He had another reason. He had thought about it most of the night. He was going to say something to the Vorat Marshal over an open channel that would be monitored by the entire Concord. He didn't want his words to be the words of a man defending a door. He wanted them to be the words of a man standing in the middle of a room he owned. There was a difference. The galaxy needed to understand that difference. On the Concord station, ARS Prime, the night cycle had progressed several hours, and most of the diplomatic staff were asleep or in their private cabins. But the Concord's automated monitoring systems never slept. And when the contact array of 193 Vorat ships appeared in Sol space, the system noted it, and the duty officers were awakened, and the lights in certain key rooms flickered back on. The Concord did not interfere in military affairs between members and non-members in most cases. Article 17 was clear in that regard. But 200 warships entering the system of a member, even a provisional one, was not an ordinary circumstance. And the duty staff had the authority to open monitoring channels and observe. So, the Concord watched. In a secure communication room, an analyst named Callie, working for the Ket delegation and staying up late due to personal habits, noticed the channels opening and began to follow the data. He sent a quick message to Delegate Worf. Contact confirmed. Vorat fleet in system. I recommend you wake up. Worf was on his feet in 4 minutes. He was looking at the data in 5. The Solari representative, who hadn't been sleeping as very old beings sometimes don't sleep, due to the simple impossibility of dozing off, was already watching when the Vorat fleet crossed the border of the outer system. He sat in his private room with a warm drink and a data ribbon on his screen, watching the way he watched most things, with patience, attention, and without immediate conclusions, because he had learned decades ago that immediate conclusions are how experienced people make avoidable mistakes. He noted the size of the fleet. He noted the lack of any Earth reaction so far. He noted that the solar system was very quiet on all sensor bands, which was either the silence of a place that had nothing to show or the silence of a place that had very good reasons to remain hidden. He cleared his throat. He wasn't sure which it was. He suspected he would know soon. Supreme Marshal Katara was on the bridge of his flagship, the warship Katara, as they crossed the border of the inner system. Katara was a large vessel by Vorat standards, 800 meters from stern to bow, bristling with weapons, with a crew of over 1,000. By the standards of what was waiting in the asteroid belt, she was a mid-sized ship. Katara knew his scanning systems were active and continuously scanning the system ahead. The data returned clean. 7 frigates in close orbit of Earth, their signatures matched the data shown several months ago precisely. The orbital platform was still there, still aging, still presenting the same limited threat profile as always. The asteroid belt was exactly the same as on all maps. A field of rocks, cold, quiet, geologically active in the slow, erasing sense in which a field of rocks is active over millions of years. No dreadnoughts, no battleships, no hidden fleet. His chief sensor officer reported that there were some unusual thermal anomalies in the belt, faint, possibly geological, not consistent with active power systems. The chief officer recommended entering them into the log for subsequent review. Katsara acknowledged the report and returned to watching the approach. He thought about the human ambassador at the Concord. Her stillness bothered him a little. When he reviewed the recording of the forum session, it was a variety of stillness that, from the outside, looked identical but originated from somewhere very far away. He had seen both types during his career. He told himself he was overanalyzing a habit of a long career to find complexity where there was none. He was 2 hours from the threshold when the transmission came. It came on all frequencies: audio, video, text in 17 different languages of the Concord, including standard Vorat, and a mathematical sequence at the beginning that was the galactic agreement for a signal intended to be understood by any rational recipient. It could not be missed. It could not be dismissed. It was designed for simultaneous reception by every ship in his fleet. Katsara watched as it appeared on his screen. He watched as the image resolved. The human earthling sat at a simple table. No dramatic background, no visible weapons, no flags or insignia other than the rank markings on the collar of a senior officer. Gray hair, calm face, a cup of coffee on the table next to him, which Katsara noticed and found remotely strange. The man spoke. He said in standard Vorat, which was accented but perfectly correct, that the fleet was now inside the established human exclusion zone. He said that their weapon locks and active targeting systems on the Vorat ships, which had been operating since their entry into the system, had been detected and logged. He said the fleet had 1 hour to reverse course and begin a withdrawal from the solar system. He said it calmly, without heat, without visible anger, as if he were providing information about a schedule. He said that failure to withdraw within 1 hour would result in the United Earth Fleet responding with appropriate and overwhelming force. He gave his name, Admiral Haruta Shen, United Earth Fleet. Then the transmission ended. On the bridge of the Katara, a long silence followed. Katsara looked at the transmission data. He processed it. He looked at his sensor channels. Still showing 7 frigates, still showing 1 old platform, still showing a field of rocks and a faint thermal hum. He thought about the phrase, appropriate and overwhelming force. He quickly calculated in his mind. 200 warships versus what Earth had. The math was not complicated. He thought about the man who sat at a simple table and issued an ultimatum with a coffee cup next to him. He found it amusing, in a cold sense. It was either the boldest thing he had ever seen or the most deluded. He had spent his entire career guided by the principle that there was no difference between the two until the shooting started. His communications officer opened a return channel. Katsara looked directly into the transmitting lens. He said in Common Galactic that he had heard Admiral Shen's message. He said that humanity had only one choice available. He said choice slowly and clearly to ensure there was no ambiguity in translation, on your knees or burn. Then he closed the channel. On the bridge of the Indomitable of the United Earth Fleet, UEF, floating cold and dark in the asteroid belt, with a shielded power system and a crew at full readiness, Admiral Shen watched as the reply transmission ended. He sat with it for a moment, across the solar system. His fleet watched all 14 dreadnoughts and their escort vessels, all the crews that had waited some for years on rotational posts, but some recently arrived from Earth and still getting used to the scale of what they served on. They all watched the same feed. They all heard the same thing, on your knees or burn. Shen looked at the screen for another second. Then he looked at his communications officer and nodded slightly. She cut the open channel. He said quietly to the room at large, "We have been waiting for someone to say that." He picked up his coffee, drank it, put it back, and said to his tactical officer, "Bring us up, full power, all ships." And in the asteroid belt, the dreadnoughts stopped being rocks. On ARS Prime, in the monitoring room that had been filling with personnel for the last 2 hours, the ribbons suddenly became extraordinary. 14 contact signatures appeared in the Soul Belt, each enormous, each shining at full flagship power. They weren't there a second before. Now they were in the room, which went quiet. Delegate Worf stared at the data and for a moment stopped breathing. The Solari representative, watching from his private room, set down his drink. He said to the empty room in the voice of a person who had just confirmed a very old suspicion, "There it is." Outside, across the Concord network, 14 suns came alive in the darkness of the asteroid belt. And the galaxy, for the first time in a long time, did not know what would happen next. War, when it finally arrived after the long wait, did not feel the way most people had imagined it. There was no single dramatic moment when everything changed. Instead, there was a series of very quick, very specific decisions made by tired people in noisy rooms, and then the consequences, moving at the speed of physics and incapable of being undone. The 14 dreadnoughts of the United Earth Fleet were powered on sequentially within 90 seconds. With each activation, they went from cold and dark to a fully operational state in a whirlwind of energy that Vorat systems had never seen before, because Vorat systems were calibrated to look for things they expected to find, and no one expected this. On the bridge of the Katara, Katsara's chief sensor officer turned from his post with an expression Katsara had never seen on that man's face in 15 years of service. The officer was not panicking. He had already passed panic and had sunk into the particular silence of a person who is looking at data that does not correspond to any model in his training. He said, "There are active contacts in the belt. 14 of them. Flagship class." Katsara didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at the contacts himself. He looked at their size. He looked at the power signatures, which were not just large, they were extraordinary reactor outputs that did not match any known class of vessel in the Concord's common database. Then he looked at his fleet. Stretched out along the approach corridor behind him, 200 ships arranged in a standard semicircular formation. He ran a new calculation. 200 versus 14 should have been fine. Only, these were not 14 frigates or 14 cruisers. These were 4 kilometers of metal and weapons each, fully operational, and positioned in terrain they knew better than he did. He started to realize he was looking at the wrong problem. He called his captains into formation. He told them to start expanding into a wider semicircle to cover the entry points into the belt. He told them to switch to weapons charged and load all main systems. He told his navigator to begin tactical deceleration so the fleet does not overrun its own optimal firing range. He was doing everything right. He was also doing it about 37 years too late. Admiral Shen watched as the Vorat formation shifted on his tactical display and understood what Katsura was trying to do. The wider semicircle was the right response to the threat emanating from the belt. It would allow the Vorats to cover the exit lanes and catch any ship attempting to come straight through in a crossfire. It was a good tactical adjustment. Shen had expected it. He had actually counted on it. He told his tactical officer to begin Phase 1. Phase 1 was not the dreadnoughts. Phase 1 was shielding. Smaller ships of the Earth Fleet, 18 vessels ranging from frigate to cruiser that had been behind the dreadnoughts in the belt. They came out of the rocks at speed in 3 separate groups, moving quickly toward the outer boundary of the belt, where the Vorat semicircle was still forming. Their sensors broadcast loudly, and their electronic signatures were intentionally exaggerated to appear larger than they were. They weren't trying to hide. Now, they were trying to be seen. Vorat captains on the flanks of the semicircle did what any sensible captain would do. When fast contacts approached them through broken terrain, they moved to intercept. The semicircle narrowed at the edges, bending inward like arms closing around something, which was exactly what Shen wanted. He watched the formation compress. He watched the flanks pull in. He watched as the Vorat center, the heaviest part of the semicircle, lost the space needed to maneuver because its own wings had shifted inward. He said, "Authorization Iron Corridor Shen Alpha 7. 2 dreadnoughts, the Sovereignty and the Indomitable of the United Earth Fleet, UEF, had not moved from the positions they had held in the belt for the last 6 hours. They were deep in the rocks, off the main approach vectors, located in gaps in the asteroid field that had been identified by Earth research groups decades ago for this exact purpose. When the Vorat semicircle compressed, and the central mass moved forward into the approach corridor, the Sovereignty and the Indomitable were already on either side of it. They opened fire simultaneously. Mass driver projectiles moved at a fraction of the speed of light, which was much faster than anything the crew could see and react to. This wasn't smart weaponry. These were just very dense, very fast objects moving in a straight line. and the physics of very dense, very fast objects hitting other objects was not complicated and was not survivable. The corridor between the two dreadnoughts became, for 6 minutes, the deadliest stretch of space in the solar system. 41 Vorat ships were destroyed in those 6 minutes. Some disintegrated cleanly from single hits to their power cores. Others sustained damage that disabled their engines and left them spinning, venting atmosphere into the vacuum, and subsequent projectiles found them. A handful of ships made a partial departure, spinning and accelerating on emergency thrust. But the targeting system of the Sovereignty had already calculated the egress corridors and distributed the firing decision among its 6 mass driver banks before the first shot was fired. Vorat captains who survived the corridor scattered. Some pushed forward. Most tried to return or move to the side. Shen, who did not engage in prolonged battles, but instead struck and disappeared back into the rocks, forced his pursuing ships to follow them into terrain where the rocks themselves seemed to aid the enemy. He pulled his fleet back to a consolidation point outside the belt boundary and attempted to assess. He had 152 ships left, combat-capable against 14. By the initial numbers, it was still an overwhelming force, but the 14 were undamaged. Not one of them had received a significant hit. His own fire had been mostly ineffective because the dreadnoughts barely moved and didn't need to. The point defense networks around each ship chewed up his missile volleys so effectively that most of his long-range fire simply disappeared before reaching the target, and the few hits that reached the target caused no visible damage. He had commanded fleets for 50 years. He had never seen point defense work like that. He decided to focus his fire. A single, focused volley from 100 ships, aimed at the same vessel. No point defense system in existence at that moment could absorb such volume. He chose his target, the Titan's Fury, the UEF dreadnought on the far left end of the Earth formation, which his chief sensor officer had noted as having a slightly different power signature than the others, possibly less stable, possibly the weakest link. He ordered all available weapon systems charged. He ordered his captains to designate the Titan's Fury as the primary target. A single, coordinated volley on my signal. He gave the signal. The coordinated Vorat volley was enormous. 100 ships firing simultaneously produced a volume of fire that indeed exceeded the point defense capacity of the Titan's Fury. Energy beams, missiles, kinetic projectiles all arrived within 3 seconds, and not all were stopped. The Titan's Fury received 18 direct hits in 3 seconds. On every bridge of the Vorat fleet, there was a brief moment of hope. Then the Titan's Fury emerged back out of the cloud of fire, still moving, still accelerating. Its hull was scorched. Sections of its outer armor were gone in some places. A long scar ran from the midsection to the stern, where something had cut through the outer layer without reaching what mattered. Its weapons were active. Its engines were working at 100%. Katsara stared at the damage report and couldn't fully process it. 18 direct hits. On any other ship, in any fleet he had ever commanded, that would have been catastrophic damage. On this ship, it was cosmetic. Commander Durovos, aboard the Titan's Fury, had been thrown against the straps of her seat by the impacts and was now bleeding from a cut above her eyebrow, where something small and metallic had grazed her when a secondary panel shorted out. She hadn't noticed the blood for several minutes because she had been too busy watching her tactical screens, and because what she was watching was too interesting to be interrupted by a cut. Katsara was massaging his fleet toward the Titan's Fury, pulling his ships toward her, directing all remaining force at one target, which meant he was pulling them away from spread-out positions and compressing them toward her location. She said to her communications officer, "Link me with the Admiral." Shen came on the line immediately. She told him that Katsara was compressing toward her. She gave the coordinates. She said the window was about 4 minutes before they dispersed again. Shen said he saw it. He said Hastis. The Hastis array had been built for 11 years and had never before fired in combat. Technically, it wasn't a weapon. It was an engineering project, a network of mass driver systems built into 43 designated asteroids throughout the belt. Each had been positioned and targeted over years of careful work and regularly calibrated by teams that quietly serviced them. The asteroids looked like asteroids from the outside. They were asteroids from the outside. But inside each, buried in the rock, was a machine capable of accelerating a very large payload to very high speeds and sending it along a very precise vector, 43 mass drivers, firing simultaneously, all targeted at the same coordinates. The Vorat fleet was compressed toward the position of the Titan's Fury, grouped more tightly than any fleet should group in battle, because Katsara was thinking about how to break one ship, not about the geometry of 43 firing solutions. The Hastis array cleared its throat and fired once. Later in the mission records, this event was logged as lasting approximately 4 seconds from the first hit to the last. The compressed Vorat formation occupied a volume of space that, in 4 seconds, could be thoroughly filled. 47 ships were destroyed. Another 11 were disabled, spinning along altered courses without power or reaction. Of the 150, 2 ships that had been at the consolidation point, 6 remained. Katsara was not killed. His flagship was on the edge of the formation, far enough from the compression that he was struck only by debris and the edges of the barrage. His senior staff officers were alive. His ship was damaged but mobile. He sat in his command chair in a room where 3 screens had gone dark due to power rerouting, and a fire suppression cloud was still dissipating from the engine room, and he looked at what remained of his fleet. He thought of the Earth ambassador at the Concord, her stillness, her 4 words. He now understood what kind of stillness that was. He understood it the way one understands something post facto, when there is no practical sense in understanding anymore. He had led 200 ships into the center of something that had been specifically built to receive him. Every move he had made was a move they had planned for. The terrain was theirs. The time was theirs. The weapons were beyond everything he had been told existed. A fleet he had been guaranteed did not exist had sat in the rocks for decades, waiting in the dark for exactly this. He opened a channel to his surviving captains. He gave one order: full retreat, all ships, maximum speed. He did not sugarcoat it. He did not call it a tactical movement or a strategic redistribution of forces. He called it what it was. He watched as his 62 remaining ships sped away from the belt, from the inner system, even moving in a ragged state, the way surviving fleets move when they are no longer organized but simply running. Behind them, the 14 dreadnoughts did not pursue. They didn't need to. They held their positions in the rocks and on the edge of the belt, weapons still active. Power signatures still burning on every sensor band in the system, visible to every monitoring device the Concord had directed at Sol, visible to the entire galaxy. Specialist Ashade was still in the machine monitoring compartment of the Indomitable. The battle had passed through her screens in the form of data, energy readings, damage logs of other vessels, fire control sequences registered as load spikes on the reactor. She had performed her job throughout the engagement tracking, logging, and reporting without being ordered to do anything dramatic. When the order to retreat registered on the fleet's tactical channel, not an Earth order, but a Vorat one, because their communication encryption had been hacked 14 months ago by a team from Fort Silence, and no one had told them, she watched as the 62 red contact markers began to speed away from Sol. She looked at the display for a long time, then leaned back in her chair and very slowly exhaled, like a person who had held tension in their body for a long time without fully realizing it. One of the other engineers across the Commonwealth Go saying, her age, who had served on the Continental Detachment for 3 assignments and had a reputation for never showing emotion, looked at the same feed. He said without turning around, "Well, that's that," she replied. "Yes." He nodded. Then he returned to his readings. Briefly, because the reactor still needed monitoring, and the ship still needed a crew to do its job. And the world continued to move, even when something enormous was happening inside it. Outside, in the cold and darkness of the asteroid belt, the 14 ships the galaxy hadn't known about sat among the wreckage of an empire's confidence and waited to be told what would happen next. 3 weeks after the Battle of Sol, the Galactic Concord convened an emergency session which, in the opinion of every delegate in the station's history, was the most attended, most tense, and most significant gathering that body had ever held. The outer ring was full. The inner ring was full. The additional galleries for observers, which had been opened 3 times in the Concord's 400-year history, were full. Representatives were present who hadn't attended a session in the gallery for years. Some had traveled for days to be there. All wanted to see what would happen next. First on the agenda was the Vorat Dominion. What remained of Katsara's fleet barely reached Vorat space in 10 days, arriving in scattered groups. Large ships towed the damaged ones that couldn't operate at full power on their own. The Dominion's military city, Kathara, greeted them in silence. The Concord received post-battle reports from its monitoring groups in silence, where the galaxy observed it all and said very little publicly, but spoke a great deal privately. Supreme Marshal Katara did not appear personally before the Concord. He sent a legal representative, which was his right under Concord procedure. The representative was a Vorat named Tef, eloquent and reserved, in the manner of a man tasked with an extremely difficult assignment, and who had decided that the only reasonable response was professionalism. Tef stood at the podium and presented the Dominion's official position, which was that the invasion of the solar system had been a legal exercise of the defensive oversight mechanism provided by Article 12, that the subsequent military reaction by Earth was disproportionate, and that the Vorat Dominion was prepared to discuss a formal ceasefire agreement with appropriate terms of compensation. The hall made a sound. It wasn't one sound. It was a multitude of sounds from a multitude of species simultaneously, which added up to something that wasn't quite laughter and wasn't quite outrage, but sat in an uncomfortable space between them. The chair demanded order. Then she granted the floor to Ambassador Yara Owe. Yara walked to the podium from the outer ring, which was a longer path than most ambassadors took. She had mentally walked this path many times in the weeks since sending the message to Earth. She had thought about what she was going to say. She had revised it. She had refined it. She decided that the most powerful thing she could bring to this podium was not rhetoric, but information, and that the information would speak for itself if she let it. She placed a tablet on the podium. She said she had 3 things to present. The first was technical. She took the hall through the legal record of the Article 12 motion that Drex had filed 6 weeks ago. She showed the timeline. She showed the Vorat survey of the Sol system when it was conducted and when it was transmitted within the Dominion. She showed the gap between the completion of the survey and the filing of the motion, a gap of 4 months, during which the Dominion was assembling a fleet. She tied these pieces together in simple, unassuming language, the language of a person who didn't need to make her evidence more dramatic, because it was dramatic enough already. And she said that the Article 12 motion was not a legal question seeking a legal answer. It was a preparatory step for an invasion that was already planned when the motion was filed. The fleet didn't move because the Concord's legal process was under consideration. The legal process was initiated to cover the fleet's movement. The hall was very quiet. The second thing was what she called the observation record. She presented a series of communication logs. They were obtained by methods she described only as consistent with Earth's intelligence capabilities. And she said she wasn't going to discuss those methods because they had no relevance to what was contained in the logs. What the logs contained had relevance. They were private messages between 3 senior Concord delegations and the Vorat ambassador months before the fleet's departure. She didn't read the messages aloud. She displayed them on the screens and let the hall read them. The messages didn't show the 3 delegations ordering the Vorats to attack Earth. They didn't have to. Anyone who had spent more than a week in diplomatic work would immediately understand the special language of people who had been told that something was going to happen and had decided not to stop it. Cautious non-answers to direct warnings. Assurances that Article 12 would likely pass. One message from a delegate who clearly never expected it to be read outside a private channel simply stated, "Access to the corridor is worth more than a provisional seat." She named the 3 delegations. She named the names of the individuals who sent the messages. The hall didn't go quiet this time. It plunged into a controlled version of chaos of the type that happens in formal settings where people cannot simply start screaming, but very much want to. The chair called for order 3 times, but only received it on the 3rd. The third thing Yara presented was brief. She said that Earth had hidden its military potential from the day it entered the Concord as a provisional member. She said it was perfectly legal, and because the Concord required members to disclose military assets only upon request by the Security Directorate. And no such request had ever been made regarding Earth because no one considered Earth worthy of being asked. Why? Because they didn't care. She said that Earth had made this decision intentionally, openly documented in the secret records of its own government. And the reason was simple. Earth wanted to know who its friends were before it allowed anyone to know what it had. She paused. The hall was very quiet. She said, "Now we know." She picked up her tablet and returned to the outer ring. What followed was not a quick process. Nothing in the Concord was quick. There were procedural motions and counter-motions. Morning requests for investigations. Demands for communication logs for verification by independent analysts, heated exchanges between delegations at the podium, and louder ones in the corridors outside. 3 delegations filed formal protests. 2 of them were the delegations named in Yara's communication logs, which didn't improve their credibility. The Vorat representative, Tef, to his credit, didn't try to argue that the logs were fabricated. He had received the logs before the session and assessed them as authentic. He sat in his seat and made no more proposals. There was nothing left to do. An investigation into the 3 named delegations was authorized within a week. The results, delivered in 6 weeks, confirmed what the logs had shown. One delegation was suspended from the Security Directorate pending review. Another voluntarily reduced its member status to provisional, a nearly unheard-of action, but one that allowed it to avoid forced reclassification, which would have been more destructive. The third contested the results for a long time and was outvoted at every stage. The Vorat Dominion was formally condemned under Article 31, the most severe diplomatic punishment in the Concord besides expulsion. They were ordered to withdraw troops from all systems adjacent to the trade routes linked to Seoul. They were assessed a fine in a form that practically translated into a significant portion of their economic trade rights for a generation. Katsura was removed from his command by his own Dominion government, partly in response to the Concord's condemnation, and partly because the loss of 140 ships in a single encounter with a fleet that wasn't supposed to exist was the sort of result that ended careers everywhere in the galaxy. Earth's provisional membership was terminated, not revoked. It was terminated, which meant it had fulfilled its purpose and was being replaced by something permanent. The motion to elevate Earth to full sovereign status was proposed by the Ket delegation, which was notable because the Ket had the greatest commercial interest in maintaining friendly relations with humanity and had been the most clearly uncomfortable during the weeks leading up to the battle. Delegate Worf had spent those weeks quietly repositioning himself, and he was good enough at his job that the repositioning worked. He presented the motion with a prepared speech about the importance of the Concord reflecting the true capabilities of its members, and he looked across the room only once, toward the outer ring, when he delivered it. Yara watched him, expressionless. The vote for full sovereign status passed. Earth received its permanent seat, full charter rights, and a veto position in the Security Directorate. When the Security Directorate held 6 seats, Earth now occupied one of them. The signature on the official document of elevation was Yara's. She signed it with the same firm hand she used when writing every document in her career. It was no different from any other signature she had ever made, except for what it meant. And she didn't allow herself to sink into what it meant until she was alone in her rooms in the evening. Then, she sat with it for a long time. In high orbit above Earth and aboard the Indomitable of the United Earth Fleet, UEF, Admiral Shen waited for the diplomatic process to conclude before deciding what would happen to the fleet. That decision was above his rank. And rightly so. What to do with 14 dreadnoughts now that the galaxy knew they existed was as much a political question as it was a military one, and he was glad not to be the one responsible for it. While he waited, he conducted drills. He reviewed maintenance reports. He walked the corridors of the Indomitable, as he sometimes did when he needed to think, because the ship was large enough that a walk could last a long time, and long walks were good for reflection. He was in the lower observation compartment when he was found by Ensign Carveston. She was 23 years old and had been on the Indomitable for 8 months, having just finished the officer program, but she was still at the stage of her career where she was collecting experience and carefully putting it away, because she understood it would mean more later than she could appreciate at the present time. She had a question she had held for 3 weeks. She decided to ask it. She found him standing by a viewport, looking down at Earth, its blue, white, and brown colors, the thing that had been built and waited for, and now stood at the center of a galactic order that was realigning around its surprise. She apologized for the interruption. He told her not to. She asked, "What now, sir? Now that everyone knows what we have?" He looked at Earth through the viewport. He thought about the question. He thought about the galactic politics of revealed potential, about the shift in alliances, about the species that would want to trade, and those that would want to negotiate, and those that would quietly begin programs to try to build something comparable in the next 50 years. He thought about the responsibility, the complexity, the years of work that lay ahead, because security was never something you achieve and then possess, but something you constantly maintain with tireless effort. He thought about all of that, and he thought about the simplest version of the answer. He said, "Now, they will have to be polite." She looked at him. He looked at Earth. He said it without humor, without triumph, without malice. He said it the way a person states a simple fact, a thing that is simply true and requires no embellishment. She thought for a moment, then slowly nodded. The way young people nod when they receive information that will unfold in their consciousness for years. She thanked him and left him alone with the view. In the subsequent centuries, and there were many, because the galaxy continued to move, and things changed, and new civilizations appeared, and old ones faded, and the great slow wheel of history continued to turn. The Battle of Seoul was studied in military academies across 47 systems, not only for its tactical elements, which were notable enough, but for the decision that had preceded it and shaped everything that followed. And a Concord historian named Sarah Venz, who wrote what became the definitive description of the event 300 years after it, concluded her work with an observation that was cited in academic texts and popular histories for generations. She wrote that the galaxy had looked at Earth and seen a world without weapons. It had seen one platform and 7 frigates and an empty belt and a new seat in the outer ring, and it had made the most natural mistake a powerful civilization can make. It had seen what it expected to see instead of what was actually there. She wrote that the mistake was understandable. The galaxy had long ago learned to judge worlds by what they showed, because most worlds showed everything they had, either out of pride or deterrence, or simply because the idea of hiding their power had never occurred to them. Power is something you demonstrate. It is a currency. You spend it or you lose it. Venz wrote that humanity had understood something else, that a species that had survived its long and brutal history wars that lasted for centuries, plagues, divisions, failures that nearly put an end to the whole experiment, had learned a certain and hard-earned truth. The most dangerous position is the one in which your enemy knows exactly what you have. And the most powerful moment in any encounter is not when you reveal your power. It is the moment immediately before that, when the enemy has already made their move, and the power still remains a surprise. She wrote that the most dangerous civilization in the known universe is not the one that fights out of fear. It is not the one with the biggest fleet or the most advanced weapons, though humanity had both. It is the one that has patiently, quietly waited for decades for a reason to fight. And when that reason appeared, replied, "On your knees or burn." On Earth, in the years after the battle, most people lived their ordinary lives. They worked, they ate, they argued about things that seemed important and some that were not. They raised children, told stories, disagreed about history, and agreed on trivialities, and lived the ordinary, complex lives that people live everywhere in the universe when major events are not happening directly to them. Some of them knew, the way people know things that are officially classified but culturally understood, that something had changed, that the world in which their children would grow up was different from the one in which they had grown up, and that this difference was permanent, and that it had been earned over a very long time by a great many people who, for the most part, were never known and never would be. The bastion yards continued to build. Fort Silence continued to think. The Continental Detachment continued to observe from the darkness. And the galaxy, for the first time in its long and complex history, learned to knock before entering.